Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's an incredible honor for me to stand in front of you today as the president of the newly established Mexican Student Association, or MEXA, at UMass Boston. On behalf of our entire team, thank you very much for being part of this special moment, our very first event as a student organization. MEXA was created with the goal of building a supportive and inclusive community for students of Mexican descent, as well as for anyone interested in exploring and celebrating Mexican culture. Our mission is to promote the richness and diversity of Mexico's traditions, values, and history, while also fostering strong academic and social support networks for our members. We want to create a space where everyone feels welcome to learn, connect, and grow through cultural events, educational activities, and community engagement. Today's event is a perfect example of that vision in action. We're here to reflect on a date that many people recognize as Cinco de Mayo, but few really truly understand what's the history behind this celebration in the United States. This day is often seen as a major celebration of Mexican identity and pride, yet in Mexico, it's a relatively minor regional observance. So why has this holiday become so prominent here in the United States, and what does it mean in different cultural and historical contexts? To help us unpack these important questions, we're honored to welcome Professor Mark Schafer from the Latin American and Iberian Studies Department at UMass Boston. Professor Professor Schafer is not only a respected scholar, writer, and translator, but also someone deeply engaged with issues of Latin American and Mexican culture and identity. We're so grateful for him for taking his time to join us today and share his insights in what promised to be a thoughtful, provoking, and enriching conversation. Before we begin, I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to the Office of UNAM Boston, Student of Multicultural Affairs, and other UMB departments whose support has made this event possible. Your encouragement and collaboration have meant the world to us as we get Mexa off the ground. Thank you again for being here, and now please join me in welcoming Professor Mark Schaffer. Hi guys, welcome. I really appreciate having you guys here for our first event hosted by Mexa with collaboration of UNAM Boston. So right now, as you can see, this is Cinco de Mayo, the 110 US celebration. I talked by Professor Mark Schafer, which is a professor in Latin American and Iberian Studies from UMass Boston. Um, yeah, we can get started. Professor.
Bueno.
What a way to start.
Ay. Bueno. Thank you for coming. Two caveats. One is that it's going to be in English. I know many of you, though not all of you, speak Spanish. There'll be a tiny bit of Spanish, but in English. And I know that many of you are from Mexico. Congratulations on the inauguration of the Mexican Student Association here at UMass, and the support of UNAM Boston, Hector Zavala. So if you're from Mexico, you may know a lot of the Mexican history that I'm going to talk about, but you probably don't know the connection to the United States history. And if you know the United States history, you probably don't know the connection to the Mexican history. So I am a professor, so I'm going to teach you a lot because I've learned a lot, and it's an amazing story. So, Cinco de Mayo. I thought this would be a great sweater. ¿Está bien? Okay, so as most people in the United States know, Cinco de Mayo is a popular bar holiday where you drink lots of cerveza and tequila, and you put on big stereotypical Mexican hats. Not so big, but stereotypical. And a lot of stereotypes about Mexico and Mexicans. Go eat Mexican food. And I just want to give a slight U.S. perspective from having lived in Mexico. So I lived in Tepoztlan, Morelos, about 45 minutes from Mexico City. And again, if you're, especially if you're from Mexico, you'll know we celebrated January 1st, Año Nuevo, Día de Reyes, Día de la Amistad, Carnaval, Semana Santa, Día de los Santos Inocentes. And I was in the neighborhood of Santa Cruz, so we celebrated Día de la Santa Cruz, Mother's Day, Día del Teposteco, Día de la Independencia Mexicana, September 16th, Día de Muertos, etc., right? Basically, once or twice a week, there was some festivity, but we did not celebrate Cinco de Mayo. Cinco de Mayo, as if you're from Mexico and you've come here and you're like, what is Cinco de Mayo? Because unless you lived in Puebla, you probably never celebrated Cinco de Mayo. Cinco de Mayo, as celebrated here, is a 100% U.S. celebration. And why is that the case? That is what I'm going to tell you about. We're May 6th, but yesterday, Cinco de Mayo, a year or two ago, I was asking my students, what do you know about Cinco de Mayo? And someone said, when is Cinco de Mayo? And so if you know Spanish, that's kind of funny because Cinco de Mayo is when? May 5th, that's what it means, Cinco de Mayo. But in the popular culture of the United States, it's just a Mexican holiday. It's not a date. It doesn't have content. It doesn't have history. It's just Mexicanness, right, in the popular imagination. So you go to bars. It is celebrated throughout the country. There are parades in New York, Denver, Chicago, Los Angeles, St. Paul, Albuquerque, and elsewhere. So why do so many people in the United States celebrate Mexican Independence Day? Wait, when's Mexican Independence Day? September 16th. It is not Cinco de Mayo. September 16th. So watch out, because I am a professor and there'll be quizzes. So pay attention. There are going to be a bunch of dates. That was the first quiz. As I said on the first slide, almost all of what I'm telling you, basically all of what I'm telling you, I learned from the work of Dr. David Hayes Bautista at UCLA. And so I'm going to tell the story that he's uncovered in great detail in 4 parts. So Cinco de Mayo, what happened? What is Cinco de Mayo? Why Cinco de Mayo is a U.S. holiday, not that it isn't celebrated in Puebla. How the story of Cinco de Mayo got forgotten and how it got rediscovered and why it's so important. So Cinco de Mayo, what happened? So Battle of Puebla, Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, right? It's a commemoration of the Mexican Army's victory over the French Army on May 5th, 1862, at the Battle of Puebla during the Franco-Mexican War. So remember that date, May 5th, 1862. Outside of Puebla, however, Cinco de Mayo is a very minor holiday. It's not a federal holiday. Celebrations in Puebla start weeks before because it's connected to the anniversary of the founding of Puebla on April 5th, so April 16th. But the history of Cinco de Mayo starts much earlier. So we are going to go back in time, back to September 16th, 1810. On September 16th, 1810, Father Hidalgo, Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, stood in his pulpit in the town of Dolores, what's now the state of Guanajuato, and he called for Mexican independence. Mexico had been a colony of Spain for over 200 years. So he called for Mexico's independence, and he also called at the same time with the independence for racial equality and the redistribution of land. His speech, which called in Spanish El Grito de Dolores, the Cry of Dolores, effectively launched the Mexican War of Independence, which lasted for 11 more years to 1821. And that day of the Grito de Dolores is celebrated as Mexican Independence Day. So 3 months later, December 1810, Hidalgo issues his first proclamation. And what he says is, when Mexico achieves independence, the first thing we're going to do is abolish slavery. We're going to give slaveholders 10 days to free their slaves. And we're going to get rid of citizenship based on racial background. Right? So that's the proposal for Mexican independence. 1821, Mexico frees itself from Spain after a long, bloody war. And we're now going to fast forward 36 years to 1857. So anyone here know what 1857 is the date of? Bueno. So, ¿dónde está? Oh, I don't have my 1857 slide. Okay. 1857 is the new Mexican Constitution. 1861, Benito Juárez, a lawyer and a member of the indigenous Zapotecan people, is elected president of Mexico. Mexico at that point is in financial ruin. There's been a lot of bloody wars, political instability, economic instability. And one of the first things he does is declare a moratorium for 2 years on the repayment of foreign debt. So they're not going to pay the debt that they owe England, Spain, and France for 2 years to get the economy back in shape. Not surprisingly, they all declare their intention to invade Mexico to get the money back, but the Mexican government is able to negotiate terms with England and with Spain, but not with France. France is very interested in invading Mexico. France's emperor, Napoleon III, a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, wants to reestablish a French empire. They lost Haiti in 1804, and France wants a foothold, military, economic foothold in the Americas again. They imagined Mexico would be one of the first of many colonies, and the Civil War had interrupted in the United States cotton, which was necessary for making all fabric, going from the United States to France. And so he was hoping that that might help things a little bit with trade from the Americas to France. So they have their eyes set on Mexico. In 1861, late 1861, 6,000 well-armed French troops stormed the port of Veracruz, and they set off for Mexico City, where they're going to depose President Juárez and turn Mexico into a colony of France. But they first had to pass through Puebla de Los Ángeles, a small town in east central Mexico, and Juárez gathered a force of 2,000 ragtag, poorly equipped soldiers, many of them Zapotec and Mestizo Mexicans, and sent them to Puebla to stop the French from getting to Mexico City. The French had 6,000 well-armed troops. The Mexican army had 2,000 not well-armed troops, but the Mexicans knew the land. And they weren't interested in fighting the way the European rules of war were. And what they did was wage what now is called, from the French, a guerrilla war, just like the New England Patriots, not the football team, but the original Minutemen, fought the British and won because they were not fighting like the way the European armies were fighting. Right? They knew that. And so they were able to defeat the French, the most powerful army in the world at the time. The battle ended on May 5th, evening of May 5th. The French had lost nearly 500 soldiers, more than 5 times what the Mexicans lost, and the French retreated to Veracruz for a year, where they remained for more than a year. Bueno, sí. So the Battle of Puebla, the French retreat to Veracruz, and Zaragoza, Ignacio Zaragoza's victory at Battle of Puebla was historic, but it actually did not win the war. It was not a strategic win, a major strategic win. The French army didn't withdraw until 1865, 4 years later after the Union won the Civil War in the United States. Juarez didn't capture Maximiliano, Ferdinand Maximilian, until 1867. So that's 6 years later. He was still emperor of parts of Mexico. But the Battle of Puebla became a symbol of Mexican resistance to foreign domination. Right? So this is crucial information to know about why the Battle of Puebla is still commemorated in the city of Puebla. But why is Cinco de Mayo a big celebration in the United States? So there's the Battle of Puebla. So this is Patriots Day. How many people know about Patriots Day? People, okay. Patriots Day is celebrating a battle in Concord in 1775. Right? We just had a commemoration of it. It's a holiday in Massachusetts, but it's not a holiday in Connecticut. No one in Miami celebrates Patriots Day or Cleveland, or right. It's a local holiday. So why are we celebrating the Battle of Puebla? So to understand why, we have to go back in time again. We have to go back to 1848. Let's see if I got it. Yes, 1848. So 1848, the US and Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It puts an end to what we in the United States call the Mexican-American War, what in Mexico is called La Intervención Estadounidense en México, the American intervention in Mexico. It was a desire to get a lot of land into the United States, and it succeeded. The treaty, in the treaty, this is Mexico before Texas secedes in 1836. After the treaty, we are here, and Mexico has ceded 55% of its territory to the United States. From one day to the next, Mexicans in almost all of what's now New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, California, Texas, and Western Colorado suddenly become U.S. citizens, right? with that treaty. And if you were in my class, I may have shown you this. I think this is from 2017, our present president's first term, and he was talking about building a wall between the United States and Mexico to keep people from coming into the United States, or to keep people in the United States, depending on your perspective. And this, I think, was in La Jornada, and I'll translate it for you. This was a Mexican editorial cartoon. We support Donald Trump. Yes to the border wall. We'll be happy to send you the plans. No problem. We Mexicans will pay for the wall. When will you be evacuating so we can start the wall? Right? So a different perspective on the border and its history. All of these people suddenly become US citizens. 1848. The next year, 1849, is the California gold rush. Gold is discovered in California, and suddenly people are pouring in from Mexico, from Central America, from South America, and other parts of the world. Right? They're coming into California in search of gold. And what happens is that the population, which was primarily Mexican and Mexican American and indigenous and European, suddenly there's this huge diversity of people from around the Spanish-speaking world, a very international, cosmopolitan population that's happening in California and the states around it, right? So next year, so 1848, all of these Mexicans become part of the United States, US citizens, with some conditions. 1849, gold rush. 1850, California becomes the 31st state of the United States, a free state. So at that point, there were slavery was legal in the United States. There were states where it was legal. There were states that had abolished it, right? And there was this fine political balance because the slaveholding states had a lot of political and economic power. And so a new state that was a free state, didn't allow slavery, upset the balance. The southern states pushed back with things like the fugitive slave law. So even if you were enslaved and had escaped and went to a free state, you could be legally taken back by the person who claimed to be your owner. So California becomes the 31st state, and at the same time, 1848, 1849, 1850, 1851, the first Spanish language newspaper is printed in the United States, La Estrellita de Los Ángeles. La Estrella de Los Ángeles. There's an explosion of Spanish language newspapers in California, in Arizona, and all that whole area of the West and the Southwest. And there's this population of people from all over the Spanish-speaking world who are still paying a lot of attention to what's happening in Mexico, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in the rest of Latin America and around the world. A very attentive, informed, Spanish-speaking audience in California and that whole region. So they were very aware that in 1857, maybe, is this where I have my slide? Okay, 1857, they were very aware that Mexico, a few years later, right, after that newspaper started and other ones, Mexico adopts a new constitution that emphasizes and reaffirms slavery is abolished, citizenship based on race is abolished. So they're US citizens in the United States, and they're watching this happening. They're very aware, and they're looking at the US Constitution, and it's not looking so good. It formalizes and legalizes slavery, and Mexico is looking very different, right? So all of this actually comes together. I'm not just telling you history to tell you history. It's crucial to understand what is happening at that time, right? So why is Cinco de Mayo a major US holiday? And it has to do with the timing of the Mexican victory at Puebla. So, back here. So, no, not yet. Almost. When is the Battle of Puebla? Cinco de Mayo, May 5th. What year? 1862. What's happening in the United States on May 5th, 1862?
Civil War.
Civil War. The Union representing the US government, is fighting the Confederacy, representing slaveholding states. And there's a huge, increasingly bloody war going on in the east of the United States to determine whether the United States as a whole will be a slaveholding country or not. So at the point where the Mexican army defeats the French army, very improbably, right, according to the rules of war, the Union Army has been losing a good number of battles. Between May and July 1862, the Union Army won 12 battles, the Confederate Army won 15 battles. It is not clear at all. Now it's clear what happened. It's not clear at all that the Union Army is going to win. It looks very possible that the slaveholders are going to win and take over the whole country. When? So this is the Battle of Chancellorsville. The Confederate Army wins, it looks like Lee, the Confederate general, is going to try and enter the North and bring the war into the north of the United States. But on April 5th, there's some very hopeful news that comes from Mexico. April 5th, May 5th. Very hopeful news. Almost immediately, the news is transmitted and published all around the region. Everyone in the West and Southwest, as well as elsewhere, knows that the Mexican army just beat the French army. As Dr. Hayes Bautista puts it, the army of freedom and democracy finally beat the army of slavery and elitism, and it had an electrifying effect on Latinos all over the US West. The first, where's my other slide? Okay. The first celebration of Cinco de Mayo is the next year, 1863. First commemoration. And one of the first things that the Latinos, the Californianos, the Mexicanos do is to start organizing to raise funds to support the Mexican army. Right? And they, among other things, they form these things called the Juntas Patrióticas. This is my next. Juntas Patrióticas Mexicanas. There are 129 Mexican patriotic committees in California, Nevada, Oregon, Arizona. They have a total of 14,000 members, each of whom pledges to pay $1 a month, which is a day's earning, to support the Mexican army. So this is not a light kind of picnic thing. They are seriously raising money to back the Mexican army. And one of the things they do is they have this very fancy, expensive sword forged and brought down to General Ignacio Zaragoza. Unfortunately, he dies before they arrive, and the sword ends up getting lost. So if you know where the sword is, they're looking for it. They're still looking for it. Serious organizational and fundraising capacity across the region. Every month, the Junta Patriótica Mexicana committees meet. They have speakers talking about May 5th, and this first anniversary of the victory of the Battle of Puebla is used to raise money, recruit men to help Juarez's force. It's, as I said, things are not looking so good because the battle was very symbolically wonderful, but the the French army had not been defeated. They were still in Mexico. And things were not looking necessarily good for the Union Army either. And so this commemoration of this particular victory was, as Hayes Bautista puts it, a new public memory. It was a commemoration that supported both Juarez and Lincoln. It supported the Mexican Army and the Union Army. It was freedom versus slavery, racial equality versus racial inequality, democracy versus elitism. And this linkage between the US Civil War and the Mexican War began right away. The marches would have the US flag and the Mexican flag together, and Latinos were using this to express an opposition to slavery, white supremacy, and supporting racial equality and democracy. One other point worth noting is that we don't think of the Civil War in the United States happening in the West. It happened in the East, Gettysburg and other places in New York and Pennsylvania, New York, not sure, farther down, southern states. But the West, just as it was supporting the Mexican army, was also supporting the Union Army. Silver from Nevada and gold from California was crucial to supporting the U.S. government and the Union Army. And the Civil War companies in the West were helping bring the gold and silver east, where the Confederate Army was trying to get it away, right? So the West was actually absolutely essential in funding the Civil War in the United States and the war against Mexico, war against France in Mexico. Bueno. All right, so Cinco de Mayo celebrations happen right away, and they're understood both as supporting the efforts in the United States and in Mexico to defeat slavery, install democracy throughout colonial powers, and defeat white supremacy. Bueno, so that's the story. But how did it get forgotten? That is the next part of the story, and also very interesting. So the story is very clear. It is the working together, particularly of the Latinos in the West, to support the Union Army and support the Mexican Army, both of which eventually win. Right? So how was the story forgotten? Bueno. So this is 1862, and then 1870s, and then 1880s, and it's still being celebrated every year, commemorating the victory of the Mexican army over the French army. But by the early 20th century, the grandchildren of the people who were fighting, who were doing the fundraising, who were doing the organizing, are getting old themselves. And the last people who have a direct connection to why they were celebrating Cinco de Mayo, a direct connection to that connection of the U.S. and the Mexican fate as being joined and united, they're dying off. And just around that time, there's this little thing called the Mexican Revolution, an enormously bloody civil war in Mexico, and 1 million Mexicans flee Mexico into the United States, largely California, New Mexico, Texas, that whole area, right? And they come to the United States and they're like, hey, Cinco de Mayo, there's this Mexican celebration every year. And they join in and bring in, the food and costumes and everything coming from Mexico at that point. But the people who remembered why it was such a big deal in the United States are dying out. And all of these Mexicans are coming in who are very excited to have a Mexican holiday, but who have no historic memory of why it's important in the United States that the Mexicans beat the French in Puebla, right? It's just a Mexican holiday. So Cinco de Mayo becomes very Mexico-centered. And that's when we get, there's Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, to the main generals of the Mexican Revolution. It becomes very Mexican-centered. So mariachis, tequila. By the way, this is the Mariachi Veronica Robles, based in Boston, an all-female mariachi band. So just a shout out to them. Look out for them. However, no shade on Veronica Robles, but among other things, as I was learning more about this history, I was reminded, what some of you might know, is that mariachis and tequila are from where? Jalisco. Where's Puebla? Puebla, the city of Puebla is in the state of Puebla. There's actually an intense cultural rivalry between Puebla and Jalisco. And Puebla is not about mariachi. I mean, everywhere is mariachi, but it's not about mariachi and tequila. It's about, but the two main cultural heritages are Talavera, this 17th century, 17th century pottery style, and mole poblano. I mean, there's mole from all over, but mole poblano is the one we are most familiar with here, and it's one of Puebla. So mariachi, tequila, nothing to do with Cinco de Mayo. However, the Mexicans coming in were not aware that it really was about Puebla. It seemed to be about Mexico. Bueno, so we fast forward again to the 1940s. Cinco de Mayo, it's a Mexican celebration. It's a celebration of Mexican heritage. 1940s, in the face of intense racism towards Latinos, Mexicans, Mexican Americans, there's a burgeoning civil rights movement among Chicanos and Mexican Americans, and it starts to that movement starts to take Cinco de Mayo back as a sense of pride, not just of heritage, right? So it's starting to get a little bit more of the sense of pride back. Here's a photo, and again, you can see it's absolutely essential to Cinco de Mayo that it's about solidarity between Mexicans and people from the U.S., right? And then, another generation later, 1960s, 1970s, the Chicano movement grows stronger, even stronger sense of Chicano pride, a more political, historical sense, much like along with the Black Panthers, very related. And at the same time, brewing companies are starting to notice something, which is that Mexican restaurants are becoming more popular. So the Chicano power movement starts to transform Cinco de Mayo a little bit more back to something of what it was. And then in the 70s and 80s, in force, the brewing companies start turning Cinco de Mayo into beer and tequila holiday, right? Centered around bars and restaurants. Bueno, so here we are. Not mariachi, not tequila, but for most people it is. So at that point we're talking, the Chicano movement has a somewhat of a sense of the history, but in general, it's been lost. It's a celebration of Mexican heritage, right? How does it get rediscovered after basically being lost since the early 20th century, right? When it just becomes a general Mexican holiday. So how the story of Cinco de Mayo was rediscovered and why it's so important. This is the last part. I'm glad you still seem like you're following me. I'm very impressed. I think it's a testament to what I've learned from Dr. David Hayes Bautista. So David Hayes Bautista is, so in early 2000s, 20 years ago, let's say, he was poring over 19th century Spanish language newspapers. So all of what I said is going to come together. He was searching for specific demographic data. He's a demographer and an epidemiologist and a distinguished professor of medicine, director of the Center for Study of Latino Health and Culture at the School of Medicine at UCLA. And he's looking into something that he calls the Latino paradox. And I didn't know about this until I read about him. Why are Hispanics, despite having less income and education and less access to health services, both less prone, less susceptible to certain diseases, and live on the average 5 years longer than non-Latino whites? That doesn't make sense. They should live less. What's going on? So what he did, he was investigating he wanted to look back historically at what was the level of health of Latinos back as far as the gold rush and the Civil War. But that was not easy data to get because birth certificates were not regularized. They were not official birth certificates until 1880, and death certificates didn't exist until 1896. So you couldn't go to a town and look up the birth and death and see how long people lived. Right? So what did he do? And this is what I find most amazing and inspiring. WhatsApp image, there you go. So he went to the archives and he started reading Spanish language newspapers from the 19th century, from the 1840s through the Civil War and up to the end of the 19th century. And as we saw, there are lots of Spanish language newspapers and they're very active in the communities. And one thing that people did was they announced the birth and death of people in the newspapers. And so he was looking through the newspapers trying to figure out how long people were living. So as he read the newspapers, he started to notice something else, which was this very high level of reporting, both of the Mexican army's war against the French, or the French army's war against the Mexicans, and the Civil War in the United States. They were paying a lot of attention to both, and he noticed that right away, within 3 days of the Battle of Puebla, there's a record in a newspaper in the United States, in the town of Columbia, in northern Mexico, of the military victory. People knew immediately, and they were paying attention. So to me, the story of how he found and recovered this lost history that had been forgotten for almost 100 years, essentially, is a lesson for us for this moment, because the internet and now AI, chat GPT, all of the ways we are understanding information is sort of something that is just given to us. We search for it, it gives it to us, and it tells us what we need. But what's lost is the work that goes into looking at the information and analyzing it yourself and synthesizing new knowledge. So AI cannot create new knowledge. By definition, it only uses what already exists, right? But what David Hayes Bautista did, which no AI could ever do, is that he was looking at the newspapers and thinking and caring and having a perspective about what was important, what was missing, how the pieces could come together. And it was only in that human activity of actually looking at the information rather than having someone say, here's the information, but finding it himself, that he was able to uncover this whole history that it was so significant and had been basically entirely lost and just replaced with Mexican holiday. This is his book, Cinco de Mayo, An American Tradition. There's also some great short and longer video interviews with him. And this is me in the archives of the National Library in Havana a year ago, with looking at archives of a Cuban author that I'm translating. And it was in looking at the archives that I discovered something that had been rumored, but no one had ever documented, which is that all of his work that was published posthumously had been revised by the literary executor, sometimes rewritten. And it was only in sitting there and looking through and comparing the actual manuscripts that I was able to find that out. And that's what you can do too, if you do the work. So I'll end by saying que viva la solidaridad entre los mexicanos y los gringos en la lucha contra el imperialismo y la supremacía blanca. Long live the solidarity between Mexicans and United Statesians in the struggle against imperialism and white supremacy. Thank you.